per mole of 1, log gamma 1 x1 represents the work that you have to do. And you know, this idea of interpretation of delta G as work gives you a mechanism by which you can calculate this. If you go to molecular theory, you can have molecules on a lattice, bring a molecule from infinity, a second molecule, and bring it and place it in the lattice. In order to put it there, you have to do work against the intermolecular forces. You can calculate this work, and that will give you log gamma 1. Many models are developed exactly according to along those lines. So you have minimum isothermal work to be done. Here's actually RT ln gamma 1 x1. So the question is RT log gamma 1 x1, is it correlatable with market prices? In a free market, shouldn't the price per mole be determined by the work needed to produce it? I mean, if things are broadly ideal. And this is a plot from Judson King in 1970. This is the US market, and he has got a plot of log of the price against log of the weight fraction. It's not mole fraction, he uses weight fraction because naturally occurring substances are often reported in terms of weight fraction. And anyway, you have gamma 1, which you don't know. So you approximate it by log of weight fraction and plot. Look at the remarkable straight line. One data is from the trade journal, the other one is from raw materials that occur as they occur in nature. And I've done this plot in 2001 for India. Of course, petrol was way up. That's because you have an excise duty on petrol. It's no longer a free market. And urea was, actually this is pre-subsidy urea. The actual urea price will be way down, especially if the elections come, it will lie on the x-axis. Because they think all the farmer votes will come if the urea price is very low. Sugar again, the free market price should be on the line. But what the government does is subsidize and says we'll give you sugar at a lower price. So you can do this plot yourself. You can just take data from Chemical Trade Journal and from Perry, and you'll find it very interesting. Practically be a straight line. The slope of this will tell you something about the market conditions, cost of labor and so on. Then you have this criteria of equilibrium, G at constant T and P, G should be a minimum. I showed you this already. And this is an interesting result that you use to derive a criteria for equilibrium reactions. And there is a lot of algebra in between, but you've all done that and you go through all this. And for phase equilibrium, you can show that the chemical potentials in two phases should have to be equal. So what you need is chemical potential as a function of temperature, pressure and composition. Then you can solve for the composition of the two phases, which is what we do routinely. But except that there is no unique model for the chemical potential. So you have to try out various models, see which one agrees with. As I said, there is a lot of scope for that. Every other day somebody proposes a model for GXS. And one clever guy called Wohl some time ago said, anyway, all functions of composition, if you take a binary, say for example, all functions of composition can be approximated by a polynomial. So if you write enough terms in GXS, if you write it as a polynomial, you can always correlate data. And then you get a series of equations called Porter's equations, Margulies equations and so on. These were discovered individually, then Wohl wrote down the expansion and made these particular cases. Or you can model inverse of GXS by RT. And then again, you get a function of composition, and if you take the second term, you get the Van Laar model. So mathematically, you can get these. Mechanism-wise, the only two models that are available in classical thermodynamics are the Van Laar model and the Dolzalek model. All the others are in molecular theory. So this is just an example of reaction equilibrium. The details are not important, but the point is that delta G0 is minus 280 for the first reaction, for the others it's plus something. So if you're looking at a system like this, you won't bother to do the calculations with all four. Although now you have a computer, you can hit the idiot box in the head and you will get numbers out of it. But the point is, if you do only the first reaction, you would still produce results correctly. So you know many ores come as sulfides, and you know if you roast zinc sulfide, you will get zinc oxide. You won't get zinc. And then you have to go through another step to get zinc. So you can ask questions in chemical technology as to what product do I expect. This is an example. The other is, for example, if you have multiple reactions, you can set limits on the pressure at which coke deposition will occur. For example, here, this is a common problem in many systems where carbon is produced as a solid. It sits on the catalyst surface and ruins the catalytic activity. So you can ask at what pressure can you avoid? What should be the pressure in order to avoid carbon deposition? You can get a very simple calculation. In many of these cases, the point is that thermodynamics gives you a handle by which you can predict these things. The summary of results is like this. If chi is a characteristic intensive property at equilibrium in a system, then thermodynamics gives us a criteria for calculating chi. And the remarkable result is it's always delta log chi by delta T is equal to minus a characteristic enthalpy change by RT squared. And very often, even without doing any of the calculations, you can look at a system, after a while you get a feel, you say this must be the characteristic enthalpy change. You can ask, for example, if chi is the solubility, for example, the enthalpy change could be, if it's an ideal solution, the enthalpy change would be actually the latent heat of melting. Otherwise, it will be the heat of solution, either at infinite dilution or heat of solution, whatever composition you're working. And similarly, when you say delta log chi by delta P, it's always characteristic volume change by RT. The first one has always got a minus sign in front, the second one has a positive sign. So results in thermodynamics can be very confusing because you can do different systems and you will get very similar looking results. In fact, the first equation, when you turn it upside down, you can also ask what is the freezing point depression of ice, because you are doing delta T by delta log of the composition, and you can ask what happens when the composition is 1 and what happens when the composition is slightly different, and you can get results on it. So ultimately, once you get to manipulate these equations a few times, you get sufficiently familiar to be able to do this with the T. But it's a remarkably simple subject once the fundamentals have been worked out. And again, the maximum or minimum work is a change in the appropriate energy function. That's the other result that's important. So I think that's the, then I have only one more slide on this thing, but so far what I have said is, imagine you start with statements like what's the most heat engine, what's most efficient heat engine, and you ask the question, are there more than two ways of exchanging energy with the surroundings in a closed system? And one person comes along, Joule comes along after a lot of experiments, says there are only two ways, and the other person comes along and says there is an absolute temperature and the maximum efficiency you can get is working between T1 and T2 is 1 minus T1 by T2. Just out of this, you can get all kinds of results. Out of this is the starting point. See where you've gone. As I said, you can calculate the what you may think are meaningless things like height of a tree, but you can also calculate things like solubility. You can ask what's the minimum energy required. So there are remarkable questions that you can answer, and you just have to look back at the subject and say, could you ever have imagined that starting from those two premises you could have got here? So it's really, ultimately it's somebody's vision. In this case it's Gibbs and Carnot, if you like. Vision of these people, and once the vision is set, a lot of people work on it. I mean, all of us work on it, and there's no place for ego because each of us contributes an epsilon. I mean, very rarely does a person come and revolutionize the field. So you require a lot of humility in working in science. You have to accept that you're going to contribute only epsilon. But it's worth contributing that epsilon because finally a beautiful edifice is built. And if you assume that, then you can get all kinds of results. And thermodynamic results really vary. You can talk about all kinds of systems. And as I said, different engineers are interested in different things. Mechanical engineers have a lot of interest in heat transfer. And you can look at those problems and ask what's the most efficient way of doing it. In chemical engineering, they're most interested in separation work particularly, and in basically equilibrium. You know, some time ago, the US made a policy. There was an ammonia synthesis thing, and NSF put out a document saying, do not apply for project support for improving ammonia synthesis. And the reason for that is because 3 grams of hydrogen in the market costs the same as 17 grams of ammonia. So any research on converting hydrogen to ammonia was meaningless. I mean, you don't have to do it, it's already optimized. So you have to ask, how can I make hydrogen cheaper? If hydrogen is cheaper, then ammonia would also be cheaper. So policy makers use broad results to tell you where to fund, where not to fund. So I think it's, if you know your stuff well, then you can easily come to very interesting conclusions. Besides, you can have a lot of fun on your own. I want to tell you something about the molecular picture. In classical thermodynamics, if you add salt to water, you don't have the molecular picture at all in mind. Classical thermodynamics is indifferent to the composition, the way matter is structured. So you have to ask what's the chemical potential before, what's the chemical potential afterwards, and so on. So if you have salt in equilibrium with the solution, then you can say the chemical potential of the salt should be equal to, or in the solid phase, should be equal to that in the liquid phase. And that's how you calculate your solubility results. But if you look at the molecular picture, it's very revealing. First of all, entropy you can show in molecular picture is simply, it's directly related to the number of states in which the macroscopic system can exist, number of microscopic states in which the macroscopic system can exist. And you're talking a very large number of states. Let me just give you an example. If you take a box which is divided in half, and you have gas on one side and vacuum on the other side, and at T is equal to 0, you puncture the membrane, invariably the gas fills the whole, both sides. But it doesn't have to, right? Nobody forced it to. It could have stayed on the left, but it never does. And this is simply because the number of possibilities is twice the number of possibilities that were there before, and the entropy goes as log of 2, right? Because the volume is double, the entropy increases by log of 2. So the highest entropy state is the most probable state, so it will go back to that state. Of course, in statistical thermodynamics, you're calculating probabilities, you're calculating averages, so you've also got to calculate fluctuations. It turns out that as long as you have a large number of molecules, you don't have to worry, because every property fluctuates to the order of 1 by square root of n compared to 1. So since n is 10 to the power 23 molecules, if Avogadro number of molecules, you can't even detect the change. So that's why classical thermodynamics works so beautifully. But look at this picture here. When you dissolve salt in water, the salt molecules, first of all, if you say sodium chloride in water, your dielectric constant in water is very high. Therefore, the forces between sodium and chlorine ions decreases considerably, so they can float away. They can go all over the place. So they can stay together, nobody prevented them, but they will tend to go away. But the number of states that are available to them increases, and therefore the entropy of the salt will increase. But because of the presence of the salt, some spaces are not available for water molecules. So the entropy of the solvent will decrease. The question is, which is higher? Usually the increase of entropy of the salt is much greater than the decrease of entropy of water, and therefore dissolution is spontaneous. You might say this is not an isolated system, but it's effectively isolated. You have a system at constant temperature, you don't add heat, you don't do work on it, then it's isolated. So the energy absorbed to break bonds, you can analyze it further. You can ask what is the energy required to break the bonds in the crystal, because now it's in water, in the solution the ions move far apart, you've broken the bond. What's the energy required? You can calculate that from quantum mechanics. You can calculate the energy released when ion water bonds form. And this is, say, ER. And if you take NaCl, for example, EA is approximately equal to ER, and the dissolution is more or less isothermal. You don't see a temperature change. If you take ammonium nitrate, for example, EA is so much greater than ER that it simply, the solution cools tremendously and it's used as an instant ice pack. I mean, if you've got injured, you're in the team, sports team, they'll know they'll put in an ice pack and it simply freezes your blood flow and stops you from bleeding. So really, this picture is beautiful, so it gives you a mechanism. After Newton, we know how to handle all this. You can take a molecule, ask how it moves, and what happens to it, and so on, because you know the forces, intermolecular forces, you can do these calculations. Of course, you will be foolish if you try to do it for 10 to the power 23 molecules. Gibbs told you how to average it. He said you don't have to do it for 10 to the power 23 molecules, but you can have methods of averaging. And that was the big achievement of Gibbs. He showed how averages can be calculated without actually adding the quantities corresponding to every molecule and dividing by the number of molecules. You can do that in principle, but you better write a will so that your children, grandchildren, everybody continues that process. And after 20 generations, you may come up with an answer. Because 10 to the power 23 is a very, very large number to deal with, even for simple addition. So this is the molecular picture. So the molecular picture has a lot of attraction, and most of the research in thermodynamics theory happens in the molecular side, because you have a handle with which you can actually tackle the system. But otherwise, classical thermodynamics sets all the overall results have come from classical thermodynamics. I just want to say, it's a beautiful subject. It also gives you very realistic answers, because you get a plot of work against market prices and you get a straight line. You can't get a better predictive tool for economists. Of course, economists have a more complex problem on their hands. But if every subject can give them a plot like that, I assure you, Raghuram Rajan's problem of running the economy would be much easier. Most of them don't give you such a quantitative. I think that's the last slide. Thank you for your patience. Thank you.
I'm sure all of you agree. Several of you were here last year when Professor M.S. M.M. Sharma was here. An encyclopedia, as Anant himself said, an encyclopedia of knowledge. Today we have an embodiment of erudition, and I hope all of you agree. So the floor is open for questions. Can we have some mics around? 2 people taking mics. Just raise your hand and ask the question. The mic will come to you. Thermo is something which doesn't lead to questions. So I guess, Pramika, take over. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Either I've been very clear or very obscure.
Thermo.
Thank you, Professor Anand, for this delightful and enlightening talk. I would now invite Ms. Anjali Kumari to present a memento to distinguished speakers. Thank you, Anjali. I now invite Dr. Ashutosh Pandey, Head of Chemical Engineering Department, UPS, to give a vote of thanks.
First of all, I must thank Professor Anand for accepting our invitation and coming to UPS for traveling so far and taking so much trouble of coming here. And he gave a very interesting lecture today about hemodynamics. And I think this time when we are deciding on the chemical faculty load distribution, there will be many contenders who will like to take hemodynamics. And so thank you, Professor Anand, for giving such a motivating and interesting lecture. And I also thank our Chancellor, Dr. Chopra, Vice Chancellor, Dr. Parag Diwan, PVC, Mr. Utpal Ghosh, and Campus Director, Dr. Srihari, for their blessings and support of this program. And I thank our Admin and Finance Department for their hard work. And we are very lucky that we are having this distinguished lecture here, second distinguished lecture, 2 lectures just in 1 year. So I must especially thank Dr. Chopra for this. And I wish to thank Professor Santosh Kumar Gupta for the efforts which he has put for this such publication.
Students, please remain seated.
Sir,